Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you're from. And actually, we'd like to know, where are you from? So please, in the comments in the chat, say good morning or good afternoon and tell us what part of the world you're from. I need to check my box saying I'm from Texas. With me today is my colleague and friend, Melissa Palmer, from New Jersey. So we already got two states mentioned. Melissa, good morning.
Good morning, Jason. It's always great to talk to you, especially on LinkedIn.
Yeah, typically we would just call each other, but this time we've invited several hundred of our closest friends to come and hang out with us for today. We're gonna talk a little bit around business continuity and disaster recovery. One of the things that we started to do more on is there are some absolutely humbling and fantastic subject matter experts within Veeam that Dave Russell and I get a chance to learn from each and every week. And so I'm really excited to have you, Melissa, on the program for today. We want to start off talking about disaster recovery as it relates to the business. And you know, you and I have both had 20 some odd ish years or more in the technology space. Typically, the people that you and I talk to at Veeam are backup admins. Backup admins are not necessarily disaster recovery planners. Would you agree with that?
I would agree with that. And they're probably not thinking about the same thing as the people who do actually put the business continuity plans into place, or at least spearhead them in environment, are thinking about, right? Those backup admins, they're very tactical. They're very, how long does it take me to do this restore, that kind of thing. They're very good at making sure all our resources are protected, of course, in the event of a disaster. But, when it comes to recovery, they might not be thinking of things in the terms of RPOs and RTOs like some of the people from the business might be.
Yeah, and I should make a plug. We're going to be talking about this more during the rest of the half hour, but Melissa and I are joined by one of Veeam's BCDR consulting architects. We've got a webcast coming up in a few weeks, and so we've pulled a little bit of the material for that webcast into today just to kind of talk about it at a higher level. Let's talk about that skills point that, Melissa, that you mentioned a few minutes ago. If we go to the first slide, you can actually see what is the typical backup admin. What are their must knows and their should knows, right? So the must know is, and there's a reason that's a green block there, right? They must know how to use Veeam or any other lackluster backup product that wants to be Veeam, right? But they have to know how the backup stuff works. And then
Absolutely.
And then they ought to know, and this actually is where you come from, right? They ought to know. Yes. A little bit about the applications they're protecting, a little bit about the infrastructure and the virtualization, the storage, the pieces that they are protecting and recovering, right?
Right, exactly. And that's something I always kind of preach from a technology aspect is, if you're the backup admin or if you're the VMware admin, right, it's not enough to know just your piece, right? Sure, you're SME on backup and recovery or backup and replication, in our case, Veeam, or in VMware, but you really need that whole understanding of what VMware touches and what Veeam touches, right, to get the whole picture of infrastructure and how to truly protect it and make it highly available.
Yeah, in fact, I wrote a book back in 2010. No one reads it anymore. It's not worth reading. But each chapter was just on an application. So I wrote to that backup admin, basically said there was a chapter on Exchange, and here's everything you need to know about Exchange for the sake of backing up and recovering it. I can't do anything else with Exchange. I'm not an Exchange admin, but I could back it up and recover it. Another chapter for SQL, another chapter for virtualization. But really, you just need to know that next piece in the puzzle. But when we talk about, let's flip to the rest of that slide. Let's talk about what real disaster recovery planners look like, right? And to look at what they need to know, notice how that green box goes from must to you might know how the backup product works. But that's not really your focus, right? Your focus is what's on that right
exactly.
side.
And it's not even that you might know how the backup product works. You probably could know what it's capable of. Can it get me the RTOs and RPOs that I seek in my environment? But you might not know, here's how I create a backup job in Veeam, although it's stupid simple and probably anybody could figure it out. But they're not focusing on that level. They're more thinking about RPOs, RTOs, applications, the order applications need to come up in to support our business, right? So it's not the order of the VMs they're concerned about, but what application is the most important and which one should come up first.
Yeah, absolutely. So look at that right-hand side. So we're talking about aligning the business to what are the business processes, what are the economic impacts, pro and con. what are the IT systems that that each of the business units actually depend on. Also, there's a lot in BCDR that has to do with what industry that you come from, what geography are you in, what sovereignty are you in. So that's a very different set of skills. Before we move forward from that, we got to give a shout out to so many folks who are chiming in. Thank you for doing that. Just please keep the comments coming. But so far, we have hellos in from Mexico, from Turkey, from Italy, UK, India, Romania, Germany, Switzerland, the Netherlands. Also got to give a couple props out to a few states. California, they are kind of a country in themselves, no offense. Montana, Washington, D.C. Hey, Jordan is back in the house. So last week, I think we had our first Jordan chime in, and they came back. So
welcome back. Thanks for watching.
Yeah, welcome back, Jordan. And my daughter's name is Jordan, which is really confusing when I say it that way. But anyway, we got the UAE's back in the house, Albania, Atlanta, Georgia. All right. We have a few Veemers in Atlanta, like 500, I think, somewhere in the Alpharetta area. And then, of course, Vancouver, which could actually be our boss, actually. Isn't he Canadian? Anyway, so a lot of folks chiming in. So thank you for that. All right. So we're talking about from a business process perspective. Let's kind of go through. So now you've aligned the business unit owners with IT. So we have business-centric expectations. The next thing that folks need to make sure you're paying attention to is that you're not just going to say, hey, all of IT broke, so I'm going to spin up all of IT someplace else, right? It actually doesn't work that way. Not all apps are created equal. Can we get a amen on that one?
That's very true. And, maybe ultimately you will be spinning up your whole data center in another location, but the part is you're not going to be doing it all at the same time, right? There's an order of importance when it comes time to recover your apps, right? So you're going to start, obviously, one of the most important apps, the Wikipedia I created that runs under my desk for my own knowledge, right? That's not going to get recovered tier 1 or whatever because, who cares? It has no bottom line to the business. It's a tool I created for myself to use.
I don't know. Your Wikipedia might have some really informative material. Let's bring a slide up while you unpack these lists because Gartner actually had a table that came up that might make some sense on this. But keep going. So it's not going to be. It's not.
No. But okay. So start here. Critical IT infrastructure, right? Think of the things, and you might not be thinking of them in a DR, right? DNS, Active Directory, right? If you don't have those two things, nothing else is going to work.
So that's really important now. But think about this though. So we're going to talk more about testing in a few minutes. But in a real disaster, if you don't have DNS and if you don't have Active Directory, if your apps aren't going to come up there, when you're thinking about doing disaster recovery planning and disaster recovery testing, you better make sure that AD is going to be running within those sandboxes, within those test scenarios. Same thing for DNS as well.
Exactly. And it's actually really simple to do that. We'll talk about that more later. But, you kind of have a lot of people call them core services, oxygen services, tier 0, the things that if they're not working, nothing else is going to work. So, of course, we need to recover those first, most importantly, right? Because if I go to log into the app I just recovered and AD is not working, we might have some problems, right? So, but then we're going to go on to mission critical or platinum tier, whatever you want to call it. And it's really interesting there because, everybody calls this something different. Everybody has certain criteria they use to say this is our mission critical app. So it really comes down to one thing: money. How much am I going to lose if this app is down, right? And it might not be that the app is producing your core business function for you, right? But it might be your core business function cannot happen without this particular app running. So a lot of times it comes down to money, right? How much is downtime going to cost me?
I think that's a fantastic perspective. And one thing I think IT sometimes underestimates is if IT is just looking at, how many users connect to this platform as an example, or how big is this platform? If you start thinking about it from that perspective, where you have not asked the business unit owners what they rely on, you could get this wrong, right? So I had a couple examples when I was just starting out 30 some odd years ago. And there was an application that only had 10 users logged in, only had 10 security accounts on it.
That can't be important, right?
That can't be important.
10
it
users?
Just so happens every one of the titles for those 10 people was either C blank blank, They were CXOs, VPs of, and then general counsel. How important could those 10 people's data be on this particular server? Turns out I was wrong. Really kind of critical. Then there are other folks that said, like, well, there's the shipping room and the mailing application. That can't be near as important as foo, right? Well, if you don't have to be Amazon to have your entire business rely on stuff leaving out the door. Because, oh, by the way, if something doesn't leave your shipping dock, then that means money doesn't enter your account. And so during a disaster, what you don't want to have is a hemorrhage of cash flow where you don't have new money coming in because you stopped shipping product. So you really have to go back to the COO and the CRO. You have to talk to the people to figure out where's money coming in and out.
Yeah, it's kind of like IT. If you go to talk to a certain infrastructure person, let's say you're going to talk to the network person, right? The network person is going to tell you that the network is the most critical component of your environment. But if you go to talk to the storage person, they're going to tell you the same thing. Storage, most important thing of your infrastructure. When you talk to an app owner, almost everybody's going to say, my application is the most important application to the company, right? So it's important to have everybody kind of involved, the COO, like you mentioned. People will have a good understanding of the business as a whole, not just a single application. And again, tying those dollar amounts and that data back to specifically an application of, not necessarily 10 people log in, but these 10 people log in, and then the system generates X amount in revenue and will cost me if it's down.
That's exactly right. All right, so let's start to work through that. So we've got the right people, we've got the right prioritization. So the next thing that typically comes along for most disaster recovery, and by the way, we're gonna dig into a lot more detail on each one of these in the webcast we're doing in a couple of weeks. But let's talk about the importance of not only assessing business value and impact, but documentation. So the days of red books and notepads and notebooks.
I used to have a
every one of
clipboard,
those are behind it.
I had a clipboard that I kept all my DR documentation on, thank you.
A real clipboard?
A real clipboard, like a big clipboard. And it was like wood and huge. And yeah, it was a clipboard that I used for my DR activities. In the South, we would just say, bless your heart. There's got to be a better way. There's got to be a better way than pieces of paper that have to be printed all the time. On a paper or even a document on a file share that, oh yeah, that's down too and you can't get to it. Yeah. I remember the big thing was, okay, keep a printed copy of the DR plan in the locker at the DR site, but who's updating it, right? Who's making sure that this DR plan is actually getting updated every time there's a new server added to an application, or, a step has changed. We've added an additional verification script to address a specific audit point, right? Documentation is probably the hardest thing. And if you don't have good documentation, your recovery is going to be impacted as well. And besides recovery, right, what happens when there's an audit, right? What happens if you've actually failed over your data center and then you're audited? You're going to I'm going to hand over my clipboard with my check marks on that maybe I made some I shouldn't have, or it's not really going to fly. All right, I want to dig more into that, but I want to make sure that people keep chiming in, because the rumor is that the live stream on Friday actually had 2 more countries checked in than our Monday did last week. So my goal is to beat the Friday webcast. So far we've got some more folks that have chimed in from Brazil. I was in Brazil last August. I should have been back there next week, but darn pandemic. Anyway, Angola. I don't think I've ever had someone from Angola on our live stream before. That is fantastic. Hello, Angola. South Africa, one of my most favorite countries to go visit. Israel, the #1 country on my bucket list of places that I would like to go. Iran, also in the house. So I love all the folks that are coming over from the Middle East. That is fantastic to be sharing those stories. So thank you for all that. And just please keep them coming. I got to say, I'm a little disappointed that there's not more U.S. states chiming in. So, but anyway, all right. So let's go back to documentation. So, right, Melissa, I will confess, I actually once ran a DR plan that required that 3-ring binders and charged laptops were in big yellow bags that were required in the trunk of several IT and executive decision makers for a couple of years. So we've done it the wrong way. Let's talk about, what does modern documentation look like for DR today? Yeah, so modern documentation, first of all, it has to be dynamic. you don't want to mess around with creating DR documentation itself. It needs to be dynamic and it needs to be customizable as well, because, you know, one customer's requirements are not going to be the same as another. Like I know in our DR plan, way back when, we always have the number of our favorite pizza place if we had to order food or something like that, because we were going to be locked in the data center for days on end, right?
Sure.
A lot of people like to put in application diagrams for the specific application the plan is for. But you know what? Not every organization is equal, and not all DR plans are equal. So it needs to be dynamic yet customizable. Those are two probably the most important things when it comes to a plan.
So I had a really interesting conversation actually with a former Veeamer last week who actually has an entire consulting practice just around advanced architectures and designs for Veeam. And he said that one of the most important things he often deals with customers on is application mapping and dependency mapping, where you don't know which, even down to the port level, how do you move data between applications, and how do you know which applications are talking depending on which databases? Really an interesting topic, and most SMEs don't ever get to that degree.
Again, because a lot of people, our tendency is to kind of be in our one area that we're an expert in. That's why it's so important to kind of look into the other areas. You know, early in my career, one of the best ways I learned things was, you know, going outside the scope of my job, going to sit with the networking guys for a little bit when they were making my application changes or my changings that I needed as a virtualization people. Hey, do you mind if I swing by while you're doing this and just kind of talk me through it? And amazingly enough, it worked, and lots of people were willing to do that kind of thing. People are always willing to share knowledge, right? So it just kind of makes you a better administrator, architect, engineer by getting a better understanding of everything else. Just on if we flip it to the application side, okay, I have we're just going to call it the CXO application, and I might be that application owner, but I know there's another application of a similar system, or even that shipping system, right, that we use the example of. Yep. As an application owner, it would probably behoove me to get to know them, because they might be doing things in their application from an availability perspective that I might not be doing in mine. We can always kind of all learn from each other, especially in the area of BCDR.
Well, also, I think that you get good empathy. So let me just offer this out to anyone who's out there. And if you're an executive, this is something that I hope that you try to encourage within your IT team's culture. And that is that if you get people to cross-train even a little bit, it makes them better partners. It makes them have better empathy to each other. If I understand a little bit more about storage, Melissa has been teaching me the ins and outs of NetApp for the last 2 months, because I always just relied on the storage being there. But I appreciate the storage admin's role more, having now configured my first SVMs and my first nodes and my first cluster. That's hard. Anyway, so that's a different conversation along the way. But absolutely having that cross-training. Also, from a disaster recovery perspective, let's get kind of real for a second. You should not presume that the technology experts who developed your DR plan are going to be there to enact it, right? And so let me give you 2 examples, one less pleasant than the other. So I'm down in Texas. We had floods down in Houston. We have them every couple of years. And I guarantee if my data center is flooded, and I'm an IT guy, but my house is also flooded, I am not coming to work that day because I'm busy bailing out my house. I would rather keep my wife happy than my CMO. So
you need to separate that out of a DR, right? It shouldn't be that Melissa and Jason are the only people that can recover these applications, right? That's not going to fly. In an ideal world, anybody can go in and hit that big red button, right? Your plans are so solid, you've tested them so much that in the disaster, whoever is on call from ops can log into whatever technical system you're using to recover, hit the button, and send everything on its way, right?
Oh, right. I had, let's go back a ways. So 9/11, I had customers in Tower 1, and their disaster recovery was in Tower 2, and it was the same team members, right? Now, in that kind of example, that entire Northeast corridor was impacted. The tertiary site for that data was in Hoboken, New Jersey. People couldn't move between those locations. Northeast power outages, same way. West Coast forest fires going on, same way. You have to presume that for a myriad of reasons, the local expert is not going to be the one who enacts that data, which is why.
And that's so probably one of the biggest errors that people make, right? You know, if your virtualization engineer is the one putting together the plan for recovering their VMs, you're going to assume that person's going to be the one doing the recovery. That just really isn't the case for any number of reasons, right? People move on from careers and jobs. And whoever owns that documentation, right? Let's say I was the SME for all the VMware recoveries, right? And I left and I went to go work for Veeam, right? What happens to my DR plan? Did anybody even realize that I did it? Did anybody go and update that? What about all the new VMs that were added, right? That's stuff that people don't normally look after.
They're only going to discover the holes in their process from a person and from a documentation perspective the next time they test it. So let's talk about that a little bit more through the process, right? So, when I used to be a full-time DR person, I used to sit down with the CXOs, and the CXOs were like, well, why does my DR plan only test at 60% positive? And I'm thinking that's a good thing.
Yeah, right. That's pretty good, actually.
Yeah, it is. 64%, I think, was the average last time I actually ran data on it. And what I tell the CXOs, because the problem is the IT folks think they're trying to get 80, 90, 100% tested. And that's just not right, because and for folks at home, write this down on a Post-it note. Write this down. When you test, you should be looking for red X's. Don't look for green check marks, right?
And because that's a tendency, right? You want to see green in a test. I used to do DR tests, and it would be like, hey, we're all going to lock ourselves in the data center for a weekend, maybe kind of recover 1 or 2 servers, the bare minimum to get the app running. And as long as by Sunday night, like, we're ready to go home, and it's kind of okay, we're going to put all the green check marks on my clipboard and say, hey, we're successful. Sure, your DR test was successful, but can you actually successfully recover your application? Those are 2 completely different things.
No, absolutely. You should be celebrating those red X's, because red X's means we have identified opportunities to improve, right? We have identified things that during the test went bad, and we should fix them so that when we need that data, it'll actually be able to come up. You should be celebrating red X's. The other thing, Melissa, you mentioned it. You said, we're going to lock ourselves in a room and we're going to test this stuff, right? I hated that 1 weekend a year.
That's why you need to remember from the pizza place, right?
Yeah, but okay, so for 3 days, I'm going to ignore the rest of the world. I'm going to go into some cold or warm site someplace, and I'm going to pretend the entire world just cratered, and I will resume IT. That's not how DR should be tested, right? We should be testing one workload at a time, recurringly. Test little, test often.
Right.
Amen?
Exactly. And beyond testing it, right, have documentation actually proving that your test was either successful and you met your RTO, or that you failed and you have the red X's that you need to go back and fix, and then test it again.
All right. So I want to dig into that. And when we come back, we're going to talk about the technology that you actually should be using. You have a depth of actual subject matter expertise in our Veeam bits. We should check those. Before we do, let's check on the map. So how are we doing on the map? So we've got Serbia in the house, Bayside, New York. Okay. That's not too far from you, right? Ohio's in the house. Hopefully someone other than a Veeamer. Turkey, Nairobi, Kenya, and Morocco. So how do we get Bayside, New York and Morocco at this? I'm just
because the subject is just so interesting. And whether you're in Bayside, New York or Morocco, you probably have a reason to need a DR plan.
Amen. Amen. All right. So let's talk about the how on that one for a second. So, so some of the areas that you have deep expertise in, you came to Veeam from NetApp. So you have just a little bit of storage.
Just a little bit.
Let's talk about, what does Veeam do in storage? That's not an area that we typically get to talk about on Mondays. Can we bring up the architecture and have us walk you through it?
Yeah, exactly. So this, I want to kind of specifically talk about how a storage level failover would work and how we can do things really awesomely with our Veeam Availability Orchestrator product. Just because, our first storage integration in Veeam Availability Orchestrator was V3, we're going to talk about NetApp here. In the event of a disaster, your production site would simply go away. You would need a couple different people, right? You'd need your storage team on call to talk to your VMware team and say, hey, VMware team, here's your storage. Now connected to vSphere. The VMware team would connect it to vSphere. They'd start up the VMs, and then the application team could log into those VMs and start doing what they needed to. Besides a disaster recovery, there's also another use case for your disaster recovery plan or tool, and that's a planned migration, right? And a planned migration sometimes is even more important because there's extra steps. Your site is still there, so you want to make sure your data is in a kind of known good configuration before you fail over. So in NetApp world, you're going to quiesce your SnapMirror, you're going to break it, then you're going to do all those sorts of things. Call the VMware person, have them mount it, have them start up the VMs, have the application owner verify it. And how the application owner verifies it might be a combo of scripts. It might be a combo of them logging in visually, doing all this kind of stuff. And, one of the things I mentioned was the value of, somebody just going in with one click and actually doing all of those things. And that's where the Veeam Availability Orchestrator product really comes in. With a single click, you can go in there and actually run your disaster recovery plan, have it do all the stuff I talked about. We can test a number of enterprise applications out of the box. So, your AD and DNS that are so important. We have canned steps out of the box that will test them. You can upload your own scripts, all that good stuff. But you could do the same thing for a disaster recovery test as well, right? You can test that exact same plan you would run in the event of a disaster anytime, again, with the click of a mouse. Can I have the data lab slide, please? And the way we're doing that is we're leveraging Veeam Data Labs under the covers. We've talked about how important your backup administrators are, your Veeam admins. And Veeam Data Labs, that's something that is, classic BNR. And if you have Veeam today, you have the power of Data Labs. We're just adding another layer on it and orchestrating it with VAO. And just like a quick 30-second overview is we're just going to actually start up your VMs, a copy of your VMs, right? So we're going to create a copy of your VMs with different networking. And we have this Data Labs proxy appliance that's going to allow you to connect to those VMs without ever touching your production network or VMs, right? So you have one copy production running. You have this isolated network running with the copies of your VMs. You can test your complete disaster recovery plan against those VMs. And the VAO documentation can be very verbose, tell you exactly what happened in your plan. And more importantly, it's going to tell you what the RPO and the RTO were of that test. And it's going to tell you that hopefully you have successfully met them. Again, if you have that big red X, that's an excellent opportunity to go in and fix things. And these can be scheduled to run anytime you want or run on demand. So instead of, locking yourself in a data center for, 1 weekend a year, what you can do is actually schedule a certain application to test maybe the first Friday of the month. And after that test runs, you can say, hey, I want to leave this copy of my application running for 8 hours so my app team can get in there and do things like patch testing, take a look at maybe the security of the environment, do some penetration testing, anything you'd want a copy of your data for, but you might not want to mess around with production with. You have the power to do that from Veeam Data Labs. And they can access their VM console right from VAO as well. So that's a really handy feature to have.
So two things that I love about what you talked about. When we talk about the progression of what the Veeam Availability Orchestrator has always been about, we could spend hours talking about what.
We could, yes, we have, Jason.
And well, okay, you could spend hours talking about it. I could spend hours listening. But one of the things I love about the progression of VAO is first we understood that it was around replication, but then we said
Veeam
that was
replicas.
VAO1.
Veeam replicas.
Right. And then we said, okay, hey, but backups are a big part of this. So how do we leverage
They
backups?
are.
And that was VAO2. And now in VAO3, kind of the cornerstone on that is, okay, let's add another kind of data mover, another way to get your data out of the building and still orchestrate it within the same disaster recovery set of processes. And that's by leveraging Snapshot. So I love that.
No matter if it's a Veeam replica, Veeam backup, in this case, a NetApp SnapMirror, you would recover these resources, document them, orchestrate them all the same way, right?
And the cool part there is, back to what we talked about earlier, is we should assume that someone else is going to need to hit the easy button along the way. And so all that expertise comes in beforehand. The other thing that I really liked is when we talk about data labs, the idea of being able to spin up an application a day, right? Every other day, you can actually isolate
3 times a day. Who cares, right?
Yeah, AD, DNS, and an app. Let's play with that for a little while. And then tomorrow, do it with something different along the way. We do actually have one piece of feedback from another Jason Tipek. This stuff legit works too. I helped set up and administer DR practices for my last employer prior to VAO and GA. DR testing was a massive pain.
It was.
Totally preaching on that. Absolutely. Let's see. VAO simplified everything, even to the point of scripting an AS400 DR site failover. I want to share a beverage with that man. That just sounds fantastic. Okay, so we are coming up really on the bottom of the hour. I want to respect everybody's time. Our friend and colleague, Rick Vanover, he's going to talk on Friday. I think it's at noon. East Coast-ish. The angel over my voice said, yes, that's true. So he's going to be taking us through more on Veeam Backup and Replication 10A. We talked a little bit with David Hill on it last week. Melissa, I know that's been something that that you've been preaching a lot about lately.
One of my favorites, yeah.
Yeah, easily one of the most transformative projects we got. Do we have a QR code of last things to do? Melissa and I are doing a webcast in just a couple weeks called the 9 Keys to Better BCDR. We're going to talk about a lot of this in slower detail, a few more of the processes we didn't get to cover today.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm going to go in depth and actually show a demo of VAO version 3 too. So all this stuff I talked about, how easy it is to create a plan, test it, all that good stuff. I'm actually going to show you in just about 10 minutes. So it's really worth it. You know, you have a little bit of time in your schedule. Come join us for that. It's going to be really interesting.
Yeah. And then I think there's also a white paper that we've got some links to down the way as well. All right. So with that, we're about the bottom of the hour. Melissa, I have wanted to have you on for so long. So thank you so much.
Anytime, Jason. My pleasure.
And for everyone else, have a good morning, a good afternoon, a good evening. We're here to help. Thank you.